From Transport Topics in Washington, D.C., this is Road Signs. Here is your host, Seth Clevenger.
Thank you for listening to Road Signs, the podcast series from Transport Topics that explores the trends and technologies that are shaping the future of trucking. Before we begin, I'd like to invite you to keep up to date on logistics news and other important industry issues by subscribing to Transport Topics at ttn.ws/ttsubscribe. You can also text TT Subscribe to 571-622-0001. In this episode, we're going to take you inside the making of TT's 2023 Top 100 Logistics Companies list, which we just published on April 24th. This annual ranking provides an updated look at North America's largest 3PLs based on annual revenue. The list includes the industry's top freight brokers, freight forwarders, warehousing and fulfillment providers, and dedicated contract carriers. Each year, we gather revenue data and other information for this project by sending an annual survey to these companies, conducting additional research, and also working closely with 3PL research and consulting firm Armstrong & Associates. To review some of our top takeaways from this year's Top 100 Logistics Companies list, I'm going to bring in my colleague Mike Senatori, Features Coordinator at Transport Topics, as well as TT Features Editor and Road Signs co-host Michael Fries. Thank you both for joining the podcast.
Thanks for having us, Seth.
Glad to be here, Seth.
Before we go any further, I should mention that the complete Top 100 Logistics Companies and sector lists are available online at ttnews.com. And of course, Transport Topics subscribers already received a print version packaged with the April 24th issue of TT. So to begin this conversation, I'd like to start by bringing our listeners inside the process of actually assembling the Top 100 and the related sector lists that we also published as part of the project. Mike, can you walk us through the process of gathering this information and compiling it, and putting all the pieces together for this publication?
Sure. So the first step really is for us to send out our annual survey for the Logistics 100. This survey, it goes out to company contacts for different 3PLs that we've gathered over the years of putting the magazine together. And the survey asks for data like revenues, employee counts, and other sector-specific information like freight brokerage revenue and warehousing space, that kind of stuff. Once we get those survey responses in, we combine that data with the data that Armstrong has collected as well, and we use that to build all of our lists, that being the top 100 as well as all of our sector lists.
Yeah, and there really is a lot of information that comes together here, both with Armstrong and Associates, the information that we gather at Transport Topics, also going over company earnings reports and public filings, for example, and putting it all together. And it really is, there are hundreds of companies on this list. It's not just the top 100 companies. There are also many others, that are more, even some mid-sized companies that appear toward the end of some of our sector lists. So it is a pretty big undertaking. It's a project that we work on, not just for weeks, but really months. It's months in the making every year. So it always feels great to get to this point where we have the list assembled and we have the product out there and published, and now we can really talk about it. So thank you for all the work that you put, into that project. And, without any further delay, I think we are at the point where we should just dive into this year's rankings. Number one, no surprise, at the top is C.H. Robinson, largest freight brokerage in North America, and also remains the largest 3PL in North America, and that's no surprise. Next on the list, we have a couple of very large ocean and air freight forwarders. Number two is Expeditors International of Washington, and number three, Kuehne Nagel, followed by UPS Supply Chain Solutions and J.B. Hunt, rounding out the top five. So some very familiar names there. Yeah, I will highlight a new company joining the top 10 this year is Ryder Supply Chain Solutions. It's a logistics division of truck leasing company Ryder System. That business includes, of course, dedicated contract carriage, warehousing and distribution, supply chain management, fulfillment. They've really been expanding their logistics business, alongside truck leasing. So last year, Ryder acquired a company, an omnichannel fulfillment provider called Whiplash, for example. Just an example of the growth there. So again, those are some pretty familiar names, at the top of the list, but I think there's some more interesting changes further down the list and, outside of the top 10 and elsewhere. But, Michael, I'd like to hear your perspective on the updated list. I know you've spent some time going through this and looking at the new list. what stands out to you as you review the new top 100?
Some of the things, I mean, you were just alluding to, Seth, about XPO and just the fragmentation of the companies that are brought out from XPO and how they're appearing on the list. As you said, you have GXO Logistics at number 6, and you have RXO at 18, and also generally, what I've noticed is the headlines that we've been reading for the past year about supply chain bottlenecks and just drags in delivery times and things of that nature when it comes to the freight carriers in general, especially ocean. You get this looking at the numbers, you get to see that bear out with the contraction some companies are facing, and then there's others that are expanding, that are able to position themselves in this type of environment. So it was quite interesting to see all the newcomers arrive on the list, and also just spread out. You have Armada Supply Chain, who appeared at 13, and it's their debut on the list. I mean, but that was more of M&A, and we'll talk about that later. But it was nice to see these companies and appear on the list for the first time. And me being a homer, I just want to give a shout out to number 99, Keenan Advantage Group, KG Logistics out of North Canton. They made the list, so number 99, but they are in the top 100. So you have that. But yeah, just noticing the headlines that we've read this past year and seeing the data and those numbers laying bare as we compile this list.
Yeah, and you mentioned KAG Logistics. Yes, the logistics arm of Keenan Advantage Group, and of course, a major bulk tank truck carrier. They debut on the list, and actually, right at number 100 is Logistics Plus out of Erie, Pennsylvania. So there's definitely a Great Lakes feel to toward the bottom of our top 100 this year. Now, Mike, this was your first year working on this project, and along the way, you've spent more time swimming in the sea of data we've gathered than anyone. So I'm curious to hear some of your top takeaways now that we've completed the project.
Yeah, I mean, like Michael said, it was a pretty strong year across the board for these top 100 companies. Looking at the top of the list specifically, every company in the top 20, except for one, grew their revenue from 21 to 2022. Kuhn and Nagel overtaking UPS's logistics arm for number 3 stood out. It had the Kuhn and Nagel saw the biggest revenue increase in the top 10. They increased their gross revenue by $3 billion. So that really stood out to me as, you know, even though they only move up one spot, that high up on the list, that's a pretty big shift. Also in the top 10, as you mentioned before, Ryder, they also saw a big increase. They had a gross revenue increase of 41% and moved up from number 13 on our 2022 list to number 10 this year. Looking outside the very top of the list, there's some other interesting things that jumped off the page to me. Number 35 this year, Burris Logistics saw a drop in revenue, but that can be explained by the sort of consolidation of their business. They sold off a little bit of their business, and they're in a refocusing phase on e-commerce and redistribution. So, besides that, largely, growth across the board for much of this list.
Yeah, for sure. And I was wondering, to what extent that might be the case, because 2022, we were ranking these companies based on full year revenue, and of course, 2022 is the most recent full year, and that's when we basically came back down to earth from the freight boom in 2021. So I was wondering just how much these companies had grown, but yeah, pretty much across the board, the overwhelming majority of these companies continued to grow last year. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. I think there's more to discuss, but another topic I wanted to touch on some more is M&A. We've seen a lot of mergers, acquisitions, and spinoffs in the 3PL industry in recent years, and that certainly continued in 2022. We mentioned Armada Supply Chain is a Pittsburgh-based 3PL. Has a big presence in the food service industry, and they acquired Sunset Transportation. It's a St. Louis-based freight brokerage late last year. So yeah, that combined organization lands at number 13 on our top 100 list with more than 5.5 billion in revenue. So a big organization that we have toward the top of the list. Michael, you mentioned the spinoffs from XPO. That creates some new names on our list. Last year we added GXO, which is the contract logistics provider that broke off from XPO. They move up to number 6 on our list this year. And then making its debut this year is RXO. That's the freight brokerage spinoff from XPO, and they're at number 18. Now, when we talk about M&A, especially lately, there's nothing else. You certainly can't fail to mention Knight Swift agreeing to acquire U.S. Express, and yes, that's primarily a motor carrier acquisition. It's the largest and the seventh largest truckload carriers in North America combining. But that also has a lot of implications for the 3PL landscape as well. Both of those companies do appear on our logistics list for their brokerage and logistics arms. That's still it's not a done deal yet. The company has announced the agreement in March, and they expect to close it late in the second quarter or early third quarter. And because of that, the companies do retain separate rankings on this year's top 100 list until it's a done deal. So for now, we have Knight Swift at number 37 and U.S. Express at number 62. If that deal goes through, would anticipate Knight Swift and that combined organization, moving up the list. Also want to highlight another big truckload acquisition with number 17, DB Schenker. They're a global logistics provider based in Germany, and they just acquired USA Truck in September. And really that's another example of the lines between 3PLs and large motor carriers continuing to blur. Most large motor carriers are, also 3PLs in some shape or form, typically through brokerage, oftentimes through, warehousing, distribution as well. So these companies are becoming more diverse in their operations. And the line between 3PL and motor carrier continues to get fudged, I think. Mike, I want to turn this over to you as well to weigh in on your thoughts. What acquisitions did you find most interesting this year?
Yeah, so I think by far the biggest one to mention, although it isn't going to be represented in our list this year because it's happened within 2023, but the acquisition of U.S. Express by Knight Swift is really huge. They're both very strong companies, and that combined company could create a powerhouse in the 3PL industry. And not only are they both top 100 companies, but they're both pretty high up on our freight brokerage sector list as well. Knight Swift placed at number 30 and US Express was number 58. So the combining of those two divisions could really, really, make a splash in the freight brokerage sector. Even stronger is the merger of their dedicated operations. On our dedicated contract carriage list, Knight Swift ranked number 7 and US Express ranked number 11, combining two of the biggest dedicated contract divisions in the country.
Yeah, for sure. So a lot of implications, and yeah, I mean, clearly the headline, of course, is combining all those trucks, and it was creating this huge company in the truckload motor carrier space, but a lot of implications for logistics as well. Michael, I want to turn to you next. What are your thoughts on M&A and consolidation in the 3PL industry?
Just to what you were saying, Seth, just the lines being blurred when it comes to 3PLs and the companies that are noticing that trend and or taking part in that trend or taking action, through M&A. You spoke about Armada Supply Chain acquiring Sunset and DB Schenker with USA Truck, and we can kind of see some of the results of the M&As from years past as well. Uber Freight, being number 9 on the list from number 10 with their acquisition of Transplace. I mean that positioned them to become a larger player in the 3PL space. And I would predict that we'll probably see more of this in this coming year, where these companies are going to position themselves more in the 3PL game, since the lines are blurred, as you mentioned, and the companies are going to take advantage, especially with the technology that are coming out now. I mean, maybe look forward-looking wise, we can see AI probably play a bigger part, and in freight brokering, something that we may not be able to see right at this particular moment, but these are the times that those particular things will be in play and those seeds will be planted. And who knows, in the next 5, 10 years, we might see something completely different when it comes to 3PL. So, and just having, this environment, especially after the bottlenecks we've experienced this last year, I think that we are definitely heading to a new normal, and where these roles will be blended, and these companies, and there are going to be some companies that are going to take the lead on this, while others are contracting, and you can see this on the list, and looking at the data throughout the year.
Hello, roadside listeners. Dan Ronan here from Transport Topics. I'm here to tell you about our new extended cuts of the Road Signs podcast. If you like what you learn here, I think you're going to really love this. So, what is the Road Signs extended cut? Well, instead of ending the recording and saying our guest farewells, we're keeping our expert guests around for an extra 1 or 2 questions to gather a deeper, fuller picture of the influential topics in transportation. We capture that insight and convert it into a printable download that will help you navigate the latest trucking trends and guide your next business decision. Considering the easy, linkable, and printable format, you can keep the extended cut for your next big meeting, send it to your friends and colleagues, or pack it up for your next big conference. So how do you get the latest download? Well, it's real simple. Visit ttn.ws/extended cut. That's ttn.ws/extended cut.
I think that your thought on technology is very much on point. It's becoming a more and more digitized industry. Whether you're a freight broker with more advanced software and data analytics and freight visibility and data sharing, to be a better, more efficient company, and be a better logistics service provider to your shipper customers and your carrier partners. That's going to become increasingly table stakes, and it's that I think also is very much part of this trend toward consolidation, right? I mean, it's tougher for a mid-size or a small broker or 3PL to kind of build all that stuff in house. So that I think oftentimes is part of what's driving some of the M&A activity we've seen. So we may see more very large 3PLs, and the others that remain small or mid-size are going to have a really good niche market that we're really got to know and know who they are and really specialize, I think.
Yeah, just to add on to that, Seth, I think you're spot on with that assessment, in the sense that the M&A activity for some carriers might not be the silver bullet, the magic bullet that they're looking for. So it all depends on that niche and that partnership and the relation within that industry as well. So those things really are a big part when it comes to these mergers that we've been talking about.
Yeah. And I do want to go ahead and circle back to the broader business environment for 3PLs. We started to touch on that a little bit earlier, but I think there's a lot more to dig into here. Of course, the supply chain disruptions that were so widespread during the height of the pandemic did really begin to ease up last year. Those shippers that had been just struggling so much with supply shortages, they're just unable to keep up with demand. These companies finally replenished their inventories last year. There was this just massive buildup of inventory after all the shortages so many companies experienced. And of course, that process drove a lot of business for 3PLs, that restocking. And, of course, at the same time, yes, freight demand cooled, especially in the spot market. Truck capacity has loosened up. But at the same time, it does appear, based on Armstrong's analysis and our own assessment, that freight brokers did manage to expand their margins in many cases. So that's a good step toward improving profitability. As we mentioned, most of the 3PLs that appear on our top 100 list did continue to grow their revenues last year. Not everyone, but the majority. And again, when you just go over all this revenue data we gathered for this list, it does appear that 2022 was still a solid year for the 3PL industry, even as the market moderated. But what's your take on that, Mike? Do you agree that 2022 still goes down as a pretty good year for 3PLs?
I would definitely agree with that. As we've said before, the majority of the top companies on our list largely saw huge growth in their revenues in 2022. Something interesting that I saw was that, uh, we have 2022 revenue data for a lot of companies on the list. And of all the companies that we had that data available, 62 of our top 100 companies this year saw their gross revenue increase by at least 10%. In a lot of cases, by way more than that. But using that as sort of a benchmark, a significant portion, more than half of the list saw that significant, increase in their revenue. And even looking specifically at gross revenue for this year, if we look at last year, how many companies on the list reported at least $1 billion in gross logistics revenue? We had 56 companies on the list last year who hit that benchmark. And this year, that number ballooned to 67. So that just goes to show the scale of the growth that many 3PL saw in 2022 as we move further and further from the worst of the supply chain disruptions that we've been dealing with.
Michael, I'll ask you the same question. How would you characterize 2022 for the 3PL space?
Well, it's the era of new normalization. As you were alluding to earlier, just with the blending of lines when it comes to the 3PL market. There's companies like XPO who were ahead of the game in the sense where they had their spinoffs and they were able to take advantage of the market conditions that we're having in the truck industry and have these standalone businesses perform well for the year. So, and I think some of the companies that did not adapt fast enough, or experiencing that downturn. So I think that's the characterization that we're seeing right now. So it's just the ability to adapt and thrive in the market that's particularly changing right now.
I also want to talk a little bit about the cover story for the publication, which I wrote this year, really focusing on a more collaborative and consultative approach to supply chains. In my conversations with 3PL executives, that was one of the common threads that I was really hearing a lot this year, especially kind of coming out of the disruptions of the pandemic. 3PLs, I think the most successful 3PLs are the ones that are really positioning themselves as true business partners for their shipper customers. It's a matter oftentimes of just gaining a clearer understanding of their business goals, how that affects their transportation needs, and also closer partnerships with carriers. Right? It's not just the working with your shippers; it's also working with the carriers that they depend on, building loyalty and finding win-win opportunities for their carrier base, and then those relationships, those business partnerships, really are so important when times are tough. And I think that emerging from the pandemic, some of those partnerships were strengthened by the that experience, and there's an opportunity to improve supply chains, working more closely together at the broadest level. So I really did dive into that a little bit with a cover story that's included with the top 100 list. And another aspect to the publication that we haven't touched on yet are all the industry sector lists that we also include in the publication. So these are separate lists from the top 100. We're looking at specific segments within the 3PL industry. The freight brokerage list we publish is very popular. We also look at warehousing providers, freight forwarders, dedicated. Mike, I want to get your thoughts on any big changes or points of interest that you'd like to highlight as you look over this year's sector lists.
So the freight brokerage sector had a particularly strong 2022, as we've talked about. Comparing it to last year, with last year's list, our number 100 entry on the list reported $119 million in brokerage revenue. This year, our number 100, which is Whitehorse Freight, clocked in with $140 million of freight brokerage revenue. That just goes to show sort of the increase in revenue across the board for that sector. Warehousing capacity is something else that we look at, and that also rebounded this past year. The number of companies with at least 2 million square feet of dry storage space increased from 73 in 2021 to 84 this year. Besides that, the two sectors that didn't show undeniable growth were air and ocean freight forwarding. Demand cooled for both in 2022 after the pandemic-driven surge in demand, which led to some declined volumes. And this is seen particularly with our air freight list, as 3 of the top 5 air forwarders saw tonnage declines in 2022.
Yeah, the international freight is one area where we saw a little bit more pronounced cool down from the boom of 2021. Michael, I'd like to get your maybe final thoughts on whether it's the sector lists or the top 100, anything that we didn't get to yet that stood out to you this year.
Well, I mean, the things that stood out to me with the sector list that Mike referred to with ocean freight and air freight, those are indicative of the headlines that we've been reading on the pages of Transport Topics about the supply chain disruptions and just coming off of those pre pandemic highs and also just brokerages expanding despite this market condition that we're having with spot freight and such. I'm looking forward to I know the logistics list is coming out soon, but I'm also looking forward to next year's, just how those conditions in the market, are they going to be reversed, or are they going to stay the same? And I'm also looking at Knight-Swift as well, with their acquisition of US Express, where they're going to be on the list for next year, since that acquisition is still in its churn. So I'm looking forward to those two things, and just seeing where the market's at, and just the acquisitions with Knight-Swift and US Express.
Yeah, for sure. And actually going back to Mike's comments on some of our sector lists with kind of a higher cutoff point at the end of our lists. Sometimes that's indicative of more companies, providing data, us getting a little bit more insight into more companies, so we can fill in some of the gaps among some of the mid-sized companies that we might have missed in previous years. So along those lines, we're always encouraging companies to participate in this project every year. We appreciate all the companies that do fill out our annual survey, that share details about their operations, that help us put together as I think, a very valuable resource for the whole industry. It's something that companies, of course, can look to and be proud of their place in the industry. And also, if you're maybe a newer addition to the industry, if you're new to the 3PL world, you can use it as a very helpful guide to understand the big players at a glance. You can also, of course, see how these companies grow from year to year. You can see who's growing the fastest and how the landscape is changing. But on a closing note, I just want to make it clear to everybody who's listening how they can get involved and participate in next year's Top 100 Logistics Companies project if they aren't already doing so. So, Mike, just walk us through that. Say you're interested in participating. You think your company belongs somewhere on the Top 100 or on our sector lists. How do you get involved?
Yeah, so the best way to get involved is to just reach out. If you go to our staff page at ttnews.com, you can find my email address, and you can reach out and let us know you're interested. So that way we can put you down in our contact files, and you will get a survey for our 2024 edition once that begins production.
I think that's a great place to leave it. And I'll just say that thank you, both Mike and Michael, for sharing your insights on the Top 100 list, and of course for both doing your part to bring this publication and many other TT projects to life. So thank you for joining the podcast and discussing this.
Thanks for having us, Seth.
Thanks for having us.
Did you know you can ask Alexa to open Transport Topics? In just 1 minute, you will hear the biggest trucking headlines of that day. Be prepared and start your morning off right with Transport Topics.
We hope you've enjoyed this in-depth look at Transport Topics' 2023 Top Logistics Companies list. As a reminder, you can view the entire Top 100 and sector lists online at ttnews.com. And of course, if you're a Transport Topics subscriber, you already have a hard copy packaged with the April 24th issue of Transport Topics. So we'll be back on this podcast later this year with additional episodes of our Inside the List series as we produce the rest of our annual Top 100 and Top 50 publications. The next one on the calendar here will be our Top 100 for-hire carriers list that we'll be publishing in June. If you've enjoyed this episode of Road Signs, please let others know. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If my questions have sparked questions of your own, share them with me and the Road Signs team. You can email us at share@ttnews.com. We'll read them and respond daily. And of course, we'll be back in a couple weeks with a fresh episode of Road Signs. Until then, I'm Seth Clevenger. Thank you for listening.